I've had this set of Colorshift paints kind of laying around my house for the last, 6 or 7 months, and I can never really find a good reason to use them. At least that was the case, until I started playing a lot of Warhammer Total War 3 these past few weeks, and got the urge to paint some of the Chaos models I had sitting in my closet for the past couple of years. I've had some concerns with using Colorshift paints before, as I haven't really seen a good way to either add highlights or shade them, so I'm going to try to figure that out too during this process. The first thing I did was to spray a layer of gloss varnish over a black undercoat. According to the Green Stuff World website, they recommend that you use a glossy surface to really get the most out of these paint's effects, and since I didn't have a gloss black primer, I figured a gloss coat over black primer would do the trick. I left a single model flat though, as I wanted my first test to be to see how important it really was to actually use the gloss layer. Next up, I sprayed both with a fairly even coat of Martian green. The paint was fairly thick, and I had to crank my compressor's PSI up fairly high to around 40 to get into spray easily. Other than that though, the paint went through the airbrush fine and had pretty good coverage. Okay, so the model on the right is one with a glossy black base coat, and does actually look a lot better than the model that started off as a flat black. I have no idea why, but more of the purple is showing over the glossy base coat, and the color shift effect is much more pronounced. So yeah, let's go with the manufacturer's recommendation going forward. In my messing around, I decided to take a hard look at the paints and try to figure out what they're actually made of. And it appears to me they're comprised of a larger metallic pigment suspended in a more transparent medium. While I still have no idea how the paint actually works, I thought it would be interesting for me to try to see if I could take advantage of this more transparent nature of the medium. So I started off with a pretty heavy dry brush of silver over the entire model. My thought process here was that the purple and the Martian green would become more vibrant over a silver undercoat, and I wanted to prove the theory, so I applied a single layer over the entire model, much like I did in my first test. As I expected, the purple pigmentation showed up dramatically over the silver and produced a really interesting light purple fluorescent color. I lost a lot of the color shifting properties though, and ended up with a more metallic purple scheme as opposed to a metallic purple color shifting scheme. I don't really love the final appearance here, but it did prove my theory that we can take advantage of the transparent nature of these paints to alter the coloration of them by changing what we do prior to applying the color shift paints. For my final test with Martian green, I started off by spraying a layer of the color shift paint over a black gloss undercoat, much like in my first test, and then applied a light dry brush of silver over the entire model before spraying on another layer of Martian green. My goal here was for the silver edges of the armor to pick up the brighter purple appearance, and I'm pretty pleased with how this turned out. I think this could be a great technique to use to get some highlights on color shifted models, and it gets around my original issue with color shift paints of not having any highlights on the model really. For my next round of testing, I used the paint Storm Surge Green, which is this really interesting light blue to green color shift paint. I started off by applying a single coat of this again over a pure black undercoat, much like my first model in my last test. I also wanted to see if it was possible to get some volumetric highlights with this paint over the previous color shift paints I used, so I did a top-down zenithal highlight on the first model of my last round of tests too. And good news, you can actually build up a little bit of a color gradient and a volumetric highlight in this way. For my next test with Storm Surge Green, I dry brushed another Chaos Warrior with Peridot Alchemy from Scale 75. I thought this would be very similar to the silver I did before, but the yellowish tint to the Peridot Alchemy might be more interesting with the Storm Surge Green. And once again, I was pleasantly surprised with how this turned out, and it gave a really cool effect that shows some light edge highlighting while still has the color shift effect showing through. For the final test with Storm Surge Green, I decided to see if I could get a little more volumetric highlights into the model by altering the base color. So I did a top-down zenithal highlight of Peridot Alchemy first, and then a single layer of Storm Surge Green over that. Once again, you get a pretty cool effect with some volumetric highlights and some of the color shift effects showing through, but unlike the previous test, you do lose some of the color shifting at the very highest points where the Peridot Alchemy is the strongest. So I think I'm going to stick with the dry brush step if I'm going to do this going forward. So now that I knew that I could change the appearance of the color shift effect by changing the base coats underneath them, I wanted to see if I could also alter the coloration by adding a transparent paint or ink. To do so, I start off by applying a drop of Crimson ink into the Red Goblin color shift paint, and applying that to a model that already had a single layer of Red Goblin on it already. As you can see here, the Crimson ink shows through and you get a really interesting reddish sheen to the armor while still maintaining the color shift effect. So once again, I'd call this test a success. Finally, for my very last test of color shift paint, I decided to add a little bit of cyan ink to the Storm Surge Green again and see what happens. And once again, you get this really kind of cool bluish tint to your color shift effect. I did notice here though that the color shift effect is a little bit diminished and you get more of a bluish armor color, which still looks pretty nice, but maybe not as vibrant as a pure color shift effect. But still, it's good to know you can alter the coloration of your color shift paints without losing the actual color shift effect. So now that I've gotten over my first hurdle of using Colorshift paints, namely not knowing how to highlight them, I next want to move on to figuring out how to shade them properly. And for this, of course, I turned to oils. I mixed up a black oil wash by combining some lamp black oil paint with some white mineral spirits, and applied this fairly liberally over the entire models. I'll be wiping almost all this away next, so it doesn't really matter if you're messy here. Before you can wipe away the oil paints though, you have to make sure they're actually dry or else you'll just smudge them. So you can speed this process up by using a hairdryer, or else you can wait a couple hours for them to actually dry. Once they are dry though and have a matte-like appearance, I take foam makeup removers and gently wipe away the oil paint, leaving behind only the shadows and the recesses. By way of comparison, both of these models started off as Martian green over a pure black base coat, but the model on the right had an oil wash applied then wiped off and the model on the left did not. As you can see, a little bit of the luster and color shift is lost on the model on the right with the oil wash applied, but there is definition that I'm quite happy with, so I'll probably end up using an oil wash going forward when using Colorshift paints. So there you have it. By combining these few rather straightforward techniques, you can really alter the appearance of the Colorshift paints while still maintaining the Colorshift effect. To me, these look a lot better than just a pure layer of Colorshift paints and leaving it at that, as you can force some highlights and depth into it. So I'm going to use this technique going forward, and as I slowly build up my Zinch Mortals army for Warhammer Fantasy Battle, or whenever they come out with a new version at least, I'll keep using these techniques, just switching up both the underpaints I use plus the colors I use as the Colorshift paints. As always, thanks for watching this video. I really appreciate all you all kind of giving me your attention for these few short minutes. It really means a lot knowing that what I'm putting out there is well received by the community. So make sure you hit some buttons on your screen. Don't really care if they're the like button, the subscribe button, the next video button, the button that puts you in incognito mode because you don't want anyone knowing what you're watching. Just hit some buttons maybe. Also, I'm rambling now, but I really hate these outros. They're so boilerplate and generic that every content creator is doing. So if you have any ideas for better ways for how I should end these videos, please let me know.